G'day, and welcome to the very first episode of Tartarian Truthers with your hosts, Casey of Aussie Mudflood Tartarian and me, Jojo of A Tartarian Heart. We decided to combine our forces to create Tartarian Truthers using our two Instagram handles. And you know what I thought? With our powers combined, we can create more content. But really, Casey, can you believe that we are here making videos about Australia? I seriously never ever thought I'd be here investigating Australia's history with you or with anyone for that matter.
I know, I know. I still can't believe it either, Jojo. It's only been 4 months since we met through Instagram when I set up my Aussie Mudflood Tartarian account. And I think you were one of the first followers and one of the first people to message me. And we've spoken to each other almost every day since, I think.
I know it's actually kind of crazy because we've only ever met in person once.
Yep.
And I tell you what, I have this epic pic of us when we first met, surrounded by some old world architecture here in Sydney, um, Sydney's Hyde Park, and we're both from New South Wales. So this was probably one location we could meet, but we don't live that close to each other. So that's you on the left and me on the right.
Yep, I love that photo. That was such a cool day. But yes, so the reason that we haven't been able to see each other since then is because our state has been in lockdown pretty much. Oh, well, I think we're into like 11, week 11 now.
Yeah, we are.
Just these crazy draconian lockdowns and curfews and crazy stuff happening with no end in sight at this stage. But yeah, hopefully we'll be free soon, Jojo.
I hope so. But you know what? We're lucky for the internet, and
Hmm.
and honestly, it's not going to stop us from doing what we're doing. And I really feel like that's just given us an opportunity to delve deeper into what originally started kind of like a passion or like a pastime. But I tell you what, it's kind of turned into a bit of a full-time job. But Casey, I'm so glad that we met. I'm so glad.
Me too. I really am. We've clicked so much over our interest in Tartaria and the mud flood theories. We've bonded over old world architecture and just how passionate we both are about showing the world that Australia does have a history mixed up in all this as well. And that history just doesn't fit in with the mainstream narrative that we were taught at school.
Yep, so it doesn't make any sense. And you know, at the end of the day, we're just two Aussie girls exploring Australia's unbelievable history. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this journey takes us. Today, we're going to deep dive into some fascinating facts and interesting info on Australia. And it's not just for this episode, it'll be for all of our future episodes. But today, we're going to start off with.
So, today we're starting off with a brief history of Australia. Now, keep in mind, neither of us have a background in this kind of stuff. We haven't made videos like this before. This is our first time. So, there may be some technical glitches here and there, but we're doing the best we can with what we've got. So, bear with us. Our first episode is just going to be having a brief look at the mainstream history narrative of Australia for those of you who may not be familiar with it. We're also going to delve a little deeper into some of the unknown history that doesn't quite fit the official story. Therefore, it's often ignored or quote unquote debunked. Then, lastly, we're going to look at some of the incredible architecture that was supposedly built here in Australia in the early years of colonisation and try and figure out how it all fits in. So, yeah, let's get started, shall we, Jojo?
Let's. Okay, so here is a map of Australia, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. But for those of you who don't know, we have 6 states and 2 territories. And this is the order in which each state and territory was settled. Starting off first with Sydney, New South Wales in 1788, Hobart, Tasmania, 1803, Brisbane, Queensland, 1824, Darwin, Northern Territory, 1826, Perth, Western Australia, 1829, Adelaide, South Australia, 1836, Melbourne, Victoria, 1842. So if you look at that, within 54 years, not all of them, but 6 states and 1 territory had been established and settled. And that's pretty impressive considering how huge this continent is. And we lastly have got Canberra in the ACT, which was built as our new capital territory in 1903. So, you know what? I'm looking at this, but is that all actually legit?
So I'm not sure if it is legit, Jojo, because check this out. This is the Terra Java Dieppe map. It's allegedly Portuguese, and it comes from the Vallard Atlas of 1547, and it's the oldest known map of Australia's eastern coastline. So both the Vatican and the Portuguese, crown had been in possession of precisely drawn charts with detailed coastlines of Australia more than 220 years before Captain Cook's first voyage in 1770. So the anonymous authors of this atlas presumably used secret Portuguese and French sources, and the map is oriented with the south up. The Tropic of Capricorn is drawn as a red line crossing the sailing ship in the middle there, with the wind rose in the lower left corner. So it's pretty incredible, the detail along the coastline. You can see lots of, little cities and towns already named there. And then looking closely at the pictures depicted on the actual map itself, it's quite incredible. I mean, you've got the structures up the back there almost look like melted buildings or melted castles. In the foreground, you've got what look like light skin colored people riding horses. You've got date palms, like there's little structures and huts and things there. And then when we look at these pictures, right up in the top corner there, you've got camels as well. So remember, this is 1547, and we've got camels on the east coast of Australia. So that's the one that really kind of got our attention, because the camel story that we've been spun here in Australia didn't begin till the 1800s. So according to the Camel History Australia website, explorers of Australia's inland realised that horses just weren't suitable to explore the deserts, because, interior of Australia is pretty hardcore. So in 1840, Harry, the first camel, arrived in Australia. He was the only survivor of a small group of camels that were imported from the Canary Islands. So it's estimated that now between 500,000 and 1 million camels roam freely in the outback, with the biggest numbers being in Western Australia, but there's also some in the Northern Territory and in South Australia. So we have the biggest population of wild camels in the world, which I think is pretty fascinating. And it all started with Harry, so they say. So, Harry
Lucky
must have been
Harry.
he must have been a very popular boy. Anyway, yeah, I just went off on a tangent with that whole camel thing, but let's get back to those Portuguese explorers.
Yes, let's, shall we? So the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia claims that early Portuguese navigators were the first Europeans to sight Australia between 1521 and 1524, well before the arrival of Dutch navigator William Janszoon in 1606 on board the Doofken, who is generally considered to be the first European discoverer. In the 1970s and 1980s, German-born linguist Dr. Carl George von Brandenstein, approaching the theory from another perspective, claimed that 60 words used by the Aboriginal people of the Australian Northwest had Portuguese origins, according to University of Adelaide professor Peter Malhalsler. Von Brandenstein discusses a number of words in Pilbara, which is an Aboriginal Australian language, which shows some resemblance with Portuguese and Latin words. and concludes that perhaps 15 out of a total of 60 might be borrowings from their Portuguese, from either Portuguese or Latin. The most convincing is the word for turtle. In various Pilbara languages, including some of these many other Aboriginal tribes, I guess, or tribes, yes, Casey?
Yeah, languages that they use,
Languages or
yeah, up in
different
the Pilbara.
languages,
Mm-hmm.
which is Tartagura or Thartagura, the former being identical to the Portuguese word for this animal, and I think it's turtle or tortoise. Such borrowings must presumably date to the early Portuguese inception of the Pilbara coast and indicate that the Portuguese did communicate with the Aboriginal people of the Pilbara coast. Again, however, there is no evidence that the contacts were intensive or extensive enough to give rise to any contact language. Von Brandenstein also claimed the Portuguese had established a secret colony and cut a road as far as the present-day town of Broome, and that stone housing of the East Kimberley could not have been made without outside influence. So, I mean, that's really fascinating, really, to think that some of the Aboriginal people's language was possibly influenced by early Portuguese explorers, and that, you know, when you think about it, they must have had enough contact over a prolonged kind of period of time for it to have such an impact, which leads me to the next image. So this is the remains of Bitangbi House, constructed by the Imlay brothers and abandoned before completion circa 1844. And this is claimed by Kenneth McIntyre to be Portuguese. So Kenneth McIntyre claims that this is actually Portuguese, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these remains, I mean, and it's just a hunch, but I kind of get the feeling that these are much older than 1800s. I mean, I don't buy the whole Imlay brothers story that they started building and then just abandoned it. You know, if you look at this, it really does look more like ruins. And it looks
Yeah.
like it's just from an older time period. I mean, you know, seriously, it'd be good if we could get some sort of geospatial specialist or some other kind of, not just these historians that we always like to quote, to do some further investigations. I mean, I think truly we discover some pretty interesting information about that entire area. You know,
Yeah, I
mean,
agree, Jojo, definitely.
you know, seriously, I mean, we can also, now that we've had a quick look at this kind of Portuguese influence, let's look at the Dutch history.
Alrighty. So, the official narrative for the Dutch in Australia goes a little bit like this. So, the first European to set foot on Australian soil officially goes to the Dutch explorer William Jensen, who you mentioned earlier. So that was in 1606 while sailing along the south coast of New Guinea. He discovered the west coast of Cape York Peninsula, which is up Queensland area. So within the next 20 years, a number of accidental sightings of the west coast of Australia were made by Dutch navigators while they were sailing around the Cape of Good Hope en route to the Dutch East Indies. So these discoveries collectively became known as New Holland, and they were first recorded on Willem Blau's 1642 map of the Orient and Johann, I'm not even going to try and pronounce his surnames, 1650 map of the Indian Ocean. Yet you can see lots of locations on this map, Jojo, that have already been named all along the east coast, more so than the west coast, which doesn't really add up to the story. And just recently, D. Corboy sent me this on Instagram, and it really adds to the mystery of our obviously completely fabricated history. So if you grow up in Australia, you'll no doubt know who this guy is. He's a bit of an Aussie legend. And I think everyone watched his show, The Bush Tucker Man, at some stage over the years.
Sure did.
So take a listen to this. And thank you to D. Corboy for sending this in too. It's great.
This continent of ours is a very old patch of dirt, but as a nation, we're brand new. In many ways, we're still uncovering some of our early history. I've been working for the last 2 or 3 years on a particular project about a Lieutenant Nixon. Way back in England in 1834, there was an article in an English newspaper that talked about him. And apparently, he was a member of a party that came in through Northern Australia and did an expedition right down into Central Australia. I'll read you what he found out, or what he claims he found out. He met down there a colony of Dutch people. Unfortunately, he could speak Dutch, and this is what he said. From a few expressions in Old Dutch which he uttered, I gathered some particulars, namely that he belonged to a small community all as white as himself. He said about 300, that they lived in houses enclosed all together within a great wall to defend them from the black men, that their fathers came there about 170 years ago from a distant land across the Great Sea. Now, if this is true, that means we've got white settlement in Australia over 100 years before the first fleet.
So how interesting is that? That just adds a whole new perspective on white settlement in Australia and gives us a whole lot more questions about the Dutch and when they really started coming to Australia, huh?
You know what? It really does. And look, honestly, we just don't know who was here. But I'm sure with a little bit of extra digging, we are going to come pretty close to the truth. But so with that, we already know that the Portuguese and the Dutch were here well before the whole First Fleet fuss began in 1788, right? Now, check these out. So when we look at early drawings of Sydney from the late 1700s and the early 1800s, there were windmills everywhere. And this one, for example, is freaking huge. And if this picture was actually to scale, it is seriously the biggest windmill I have ever seen.
It's huge.
I know. And look at it in comparison to those people. Seriously,
Yeah, they're
it is,
tiny.
they're
They look
tiny,
like ants.
little teeny tiny ants. So this used to be called Windmill Hill, but today it's called Observatory Hill, and it is where the Sydney Observatory resides. Okay. The observatory was apparently built in 1857, but you know, even just looking at the hill, and I mean on this one and in the previous image, I mean it's aptly named Windmill Hill, right? But it just doesn't look natural, does it?
No.
It looks a little bit like it looks out of place. It doesn't look like it's built the way it should be. Let's move on and look at how many depictions of early Sydney that we have windmills. Okay, so this is the colony in 1799. You can see a windmill back there. And here in the late 1700s, here's a rendering, and you can see here clearly 4 windmills again.
Yeah.
And here, I mean, there's multiple, and not only that, there's other things in the background I'm sure you can see. But there's an awful lot of windmills just in this image alone.
Yep.
Okay, and here, now if you take a look at this pic, and I mean, you look at the windmill, you can see the windmill, it's in the water. That's also very concerning. But the people, look at the people there. They are dressed up kind of like in Dutch clothing. They look kind of like almost Renaissance period. And, you know, some people do speculate that this could be more like the 1640s rather than the 1840s, when Australia was in fact named New Holland. And, you know, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That would make a lot of sense.
So here, the old windmill situated in Brisbane's Observatory Park, just north of the city centre, is the city's oldest building. Now I'm saying that again. I'm going to repeat that. It's considered the city's oldest building. It was built by convicts 200 years ago, making it both the longest surviving convict building and the oldest windmill tower left standing in Australia. Now, I tell you what, like, this is kind of an interesting story, but if you look at this, I mean, I feel like it's way older than just a couple hundred years old, but I digress. So if you look at this, the blades have been removed. And as the story goes, after the convicts built it, they realized that they built it in the wrong location. This is the funny part. And it didn't get enough wind there to make it work. So the convicts had to actually manually move the windmill to make it work, which is absolutely absurd. Okay. But another thing that was brought to my attention during about these windmills is the fact that, you know, they're designed to take away like the manual stress out of producing flour, right? So why would they need windmills when they had convicts to do the manual labor? You know, it just doesn't add up.
No, that's kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
It does. But, you know, when we really look at these windmills, I feel that they are from a much, much older time.
Yeah, I agree. So before we move on to the totally nonsensical history that we were taught in school, let's just take a quick look at this article that we recently came across. Now, be warned, guys, this is absolutely definitely not true. It's been debunked, so do not believe it, all right? So we know that if something's debunked, it usually means that it's been covered up and people have been paid off to shut up about it. But anyway, this is a little section from the article. It stated that the important number of tombs and artifacts already discovered on the site suggests that it could have been the capital of an ancient empire, completely unknown to historians until now. The site, which was first noticed on satellite pictures taken in October 2013 using a newly developed ground penetrating radar. So, the report also goes on to state that 287 individual tombs have already been discovered in a small necropolis located just outside the ancient city. The bodies are mostly Proto-Aboriginal origins, but also surprisingly include a few Polynesian and Asian individuals, the report states. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered, including some 756 items made of gold. A bowl weighing almost 3 kilograms was found inside one of the temples, but Jojo, the spokesman for ANU, has debunked the webpage story about a lost city dating back 1500 years. It is completely false.
With all those findings, huh?
Yeah, totally made up. Someone was just making up
fabricating all of this gold just popping up, you know, 756 items made from gold, but no.
Yep.
Lies.
So, but then we've got so many other things as well that we've heard over the years. So we've got the Asian history with some of the old Aboriginal paintings depicting Chinese junks, for example. And there's been stories of the Phoenician trireme, an ancient warship wreck that was discovered near King Sound in Western Australia. Then there's the remnants of a Spanish galleon and coins dating back to 1597 on Stradbroke Island in Queensland. Plus, we've got the Gosford glyphs, also apparently debunked, of course, which are said to date back over 2,500 years. And then don't forget the African Kilwa Sultanate coins found on the Northern Territory's Wessel Islands. So much history, and there's probably a whole lot more that we don't even know about, and yet we don't really hear much about it, you know, in the mainstream. And as far as we know, it's never really been properly investigated. They just don't want to budge from their old Captain Cook narrative. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse. Let's take a look now at the official narrative for Australia's history. So this is what we get taught in school right from the get-go.
If you were a kid in Australia in the 80s and 90s, then you will remember that song. We all had to learn it and sing it at assembly in front of our parents. Do you remember, Casey?
I do. I actually really liked that song.
I
I
loved
know
it
that sounds so
too.
lame, but we
I
used to have
did
to link
too.
arms and like sway. Oh, it was
We were,
fun.
we were brainwashed to believe this is our history. It was all part of the indoctrination, that, of
Yeah.
our convict past.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get started with the history that we were taught in school, shall we?
Let's go.
First settlement of Sydney, New South Wales, as we mentioned, is 1788. Okay. Of the 1,530 people in the first fleet, there were just a handful of experienced carpenters, one stonemason, one bricklayer, 3 plasterers, 5 bricklayers. The majority of the rest were convicts that were just basic city dwellers who knew nothing of farming or building construction. There were no architects, no designers, no surveyors. And this is a direct quote out of the visitsydneyaustralia.com.au/history. You believe that?
It's
So
embarrassing, huh?
it is a bit embarrassing. So there obviously wasn't much forethought or planning put into who was going to come and build this new nation, was there? You
It
know
doesn't
what?
appear like it.
They just threw in some criminals on a couple of ships and sent them on their merry way to Australia. And now, what about the First Nations people, though?
Yeah,
Like,
so
I mean, this is my one concern always is like, what happened to the First Nations people who they were already here when the British arrived, Casey? So what
yeah,
happened?
that's right. So yeah, sadly the Aboriginal population was absolutely decimated once the British fleets arrived. I mean, this was through disease and just outright genocide. The history that survives orally of what the Aboriginal population, especially those on the East Coast, were put through is it's nothing short of horrifying, Jojo. And we know that almost the entire population of the tribes around Sydney were completely wiped out, and the Tasmanian Aboriginals were also totally annihilated. So the the last full-blooded Aboriginal, Tasmanian Aboriginal, sorry, died in 1876. So with such horror, will we ever know what was really going on here before the first fleet arrived?
They say it only takes 3 generations for knowledge to be lost. And, I think we lost so much knowledge about this country and its history when the British started their murderous takeover of Australia in 1788.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, Jojo. It's absolutely heartbreaking. So let's move along now to the second fleet. So the second fleet arrived in 1790 after losing a quarter of its passengers through illness along the way. So the colony's food situation reached crisis point. So before the second fleet had even arrived, the pre-existing colony was already struggling, and then later in the year, the third fleet arrives, and those convicts were also in appalling condition. So these ships were arriving with people starved, full of disease, barely alive, and they were the ones that were supposedly going to be doing all the manual labor and building a nation from scratch. I just don't buy it, Jojo.
I don't either, and then there were those who chose to move to Australia, and they actually endured over 200 days on sea to travel from England to Australia. And, after all the reports about how shitty the conditions were, I just don't know why anyone would want to come here on their own accord.
I know.
Seriously.
Yeah,
The conditions were poor.
you would have to pay me top dollar to get me here on one of those ships. All right, so let's fast forward a bit now. We've covered most of the basics. So now it's 1850. It's been 62 years since colonisation, and Australia's population is still a pretty dismal 400,000. So that's not very many at all. So what did they do, Jojo?
Ding ding, insert gold rush. So this image is of a gold nugget discovered in Hill End in 1872. And Hill End is a gold mining town in New South Wales located in the Bathurst Regional Council area. Now, will you take a look at that guy? He's looking extremely dapper and proud of himself and his find, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't he be? Look at the size of that nugget. It's nearly as big as him. It's huge.
It's huge. It's gigantic. I don't think I've ever seen such a gigantic gold nugget like that.
So yeah, the gold rush, it was pretty massive here in Australia, hey? So just like it was all around the world in the same time frame, which raises questions in itself, but that's something for a whole other episode, Jojo. But while we're on the topic of gold, check out these images. So if we click to this slide here, these are from George Lancell's mines in Bendigo in Victoria. So George Lancell was a millionaire. He was also a Freemason, which could have something to do with why he had huge obelisks at his gold mines way back in the 1800s. Weird, huh?
Very strange.
They look so out of place. I don't even know where you would get the materials or even get an obelisk out into the middle of the Bendigo goldfields. But anyway, all that aside, it's probably not something we need to elaborate too much on this in this episode, but I will just say that that is some pretty phallic symbology right there.
It sure is.
Moving on. So anyway, the discovery of gold in the 1850s started a series of rushes that really did transform the Australian colonies. So they found significant deposits down in Tassie from 1852, all the way up north in Queensland from 1857, Northern Territory from 1871. And then there was a bit of a break before they discovered some new areas in Western Australia. So that was in the 1890s. They found some gold fields at Coolgardie, and Kalgoorlie.
Those in Western Australia.
Yeah.
Cool. So, because of the gold rushes, now look, we're now in 1860, and because of this, these gold rushes greatly expanded Australia's population. It boosted the economy, and it also led to the emergence of a whole new national identity. You know, they say that during this time period that Melbourne was the richest city in the world, and at one point, second largest only to London. What do you think of that?
I think that's absolutely incredible because, you know, as we discussed earlier, Melbourne was one of the last cities to be founded. So it's 1842. So by 1860, it's the second largest city in the world. That's incredible.
You know, I'm not suspicious at all. Not at all.
Me neither. So that sounds like a lot of growth, right? So you just said that there's like 1 million people now populating Australia, but let's use this slide to put it into perspective. So if you look at the overlay of the Australian map on the map of the US, they're very close in size, both really big countries. But you've also got to keep in mind that most of Australia's population was living in the coastal areas. The inland, even today, is very sparsely inhabited because it's just too hot and too dry to live in comfortably.
It is. It's very arid, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the population is still very small, like you said, in comparison to the size of the country. And the average person who was living here was really just trying to etch out a new life in this harsh land. And I mean, if you look at this image alone, you can see it's quite primitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, you know, these people here, it's extremely harsh conditions, and they were really just working to survive. They were farming, logging, clearing land. Some people were running small shops and businesses, and mostly raising families.
Yeah, that's right. Let's have a look at some of the houses, Jojo, that the pioneers were building. So as you can see, they're very primitive. Like you said, they're using materials that they could just readily find in their environments. So things like logs, timber, river stones, mud, bark, bottle and daub. So which, for those of you who might not know, it's like a sticky material, usually made of wet soil, clay, sand, and even sometimes some animal dung to line the walls. So all very basic materials. There's no brick or stone or windows with glass, nothing like that at all. So that's kind of giving you a little bit of an idea of how our early colonists and pioneers were living.
Mm-hmm.
So before we move on, let's just do a quick summary, Jojo, of what we've presented to everyone so far. So from the beginning of this episode, we've provided the information that has been given to us via the history books on the basic logistics of the First Fleet and the free settlers, the very small population of Australia in those early days and its slow growth, and how the population compared to the size of the country. We've also had a look at the materials that the first settlers were using to build their very primitive looking homes. So it's all pointing to the fact that in those early days, this country was harsh, sparsely populated, and lacking in a lot of provisions for building and manufacturing, right?
Mm-hmm. And keeping all that in mind, let's move on and take a look at some of the buildings that were around at that time and try to see if we can figure out who have been building them and how.
Let's go.
That's pretty incredible architecture, huh? Knowing what we know now of the official Australian history narrative, who was building all of those incredible buildings? Where were all the materials coming from? Where did the labour force required for such huge construction projects come from? What were these buildings used for? And lastly, who was living in them?
So many questions, Jojo. And
So
will we
many.
ever know all the answers? I don't know. But we're going to try and figure it out, right? Because in our next episode, we'll be delving further into the building blocks of Australia. We'll be looking into its manufacturing history, or lack thereof, and the primitive tools of the trade, we're told, were used back then to build some of the biggest and most beautiful buildings in Australia. You won't want to miss it.
You sure won't. It's going to be amazing, and I can't wait. So as you can see, this is what they typically will teach us in history class, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus what they don't teach you in history class. But I have a feeling we're going to get down to the bottom of this, you and I.
We're going to try.
We're sure going to try. Okay, well, that's a wrap. Can you believe it?
I am so excited.
I can't believe we've just completed our first episode.
Yes.
Congratulations, Casey.
Thank you,
I am so stoked that we have decided to team up and put together these videos. It's already so much fun, and I already know we're going to be best friends forever.
Yay.
And I just want to add my favorite hashtag is #Tartarians forever. And please, Tartarian Truthers were a brand new handle. Please, we'd love for you to like, share, subscribe, and also follow our Instagram handles. And I am, for whatever reason, you and I, we really like underscores, and I don't know why, but mine is @_A_Tartarian_heart_, and Casey, you are
@Aussie_mudflood_Tartarian.
There you go. I've only got one more than you. That's all. Actually, I got two more than you. I'm so embarrassed. But anyway, that's a wrap. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.